Hi, and welcome back to 10 Minutes On podcast on the presidential election. I'm Aoife, the JPIT Communications intern, and I'm joined today by Steve Hucklesby, JPIT Policy Advisor on International Affairs. Steve, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Hi, it's really good to be with you again. For those who don't know me, I'm Steve Huxley. My role within the Joint Public Issues team is to help discussion around a range of different issues from international affairs, conflict, peace and climate change.
Amazing, thank you. So we've seen this morning that Donald Trump has won the presidential election and is now the president-elect for 2025. I'm aware that he's quite a divisive character, and some might suggest that he isn't necessarily completely rational. And also, there's been lots of news stories in recent years that a lot of leading Republicans have turned against him. But how strong is Donald Trump's support, and why did Americans vote for him?
Well, the support is pretty much 50-50 in the United States. This is a really close election. Some of the key battleground states, they were split with no more than 2 percentage points separating Harris and Trump. So what we're seeing, I think, is in US politics a trend over the last few years of greater polarization in politics, and maybe the very big voter turnout this time round reflects that as well.
So what do you think the big issues have been for the election this year?
Well, the US economy is always a big factor in the United States elections, and this was certainly the case this time round. President Biden had the misfortune to come into the presidency when the economic effects of COVID and of the war in Ukraine hit the American economy. Rising oil prices caused inflation to soar, and it reached 9 percentage points at its peak. The Democrats, as a party, tend to be less distrusted on the economy, and that's been the case this time round. People have seen bad economic situation and a Democratic government in power, and they've put 2 and 2 together. Whether they've got 4 or whether they've got 5 depends on your point of view. But I think that the Kamala Harris has suffered significantly in that respect. The polling shows that economy is one of the top issues for both Republican and for Democrats, and crucially for those undecided voters as well. For Republican voters, the issues are economy and immigration. For Democrats, the polling suggests the issues this time around have been economy, policy on abortion, and then defending democracy, which is a democratic concern with the assault on democracy that is being made by Donald Trump.
Thank you. So what do US voters think about Trump's foreign policy?
Well, it's interesting because a US president sitting in the White House spends typically over 50% of their time engaged in foreign policy issues. And yet only 4% of those voters polled in this election have said that for them, foreign policy is a top issue. So we've got this weird irony here. It's absolutely right that US citizens vote for their president without any outside interference. But the reality is that voting for someone who has a huge influence on the rest of the world. And in the UK and elsewhere, we feel the effects of American foreign policy, and yet we don't have any control. I think that voters in the US, they see a lot of threats from the international environment, and maybe they're quite happy with Trump's slightly more isolationist approach to foreign policy. I think for me, that's a big problem because, like it or not, America does have a huge influence in the world, and very often that influence has been positive.
So what has Trump said that he will do when he comes to the White House at the beginning of January?
Well, he said a lot of things. So famously, he said that he would end the war in Ukraine in one day if he became president. He won't. I think this time round he's much too overconfident on that particular claim. He's likely to pull funding from Ukraine. He's likely to dial down drastically US arms exports to Ukraine. But I think that he has underestimated the challenge there. If we think back to the Russian invasion and the march of Russian tanks on Kiev, Ukraine fought back that advance at a time when US support for Ukraine was much lower than it was now. I think that sadly we're likely to see the Ukraine crisis remain a protracted war situation for some time. And I think that US foreign policy on that is going to be very confused. What that's going to mean for the rest of us in Europe is European states are going to try to step up their support for Ukraine. We're likely to see increased defense budgets as a result, as European governments perceive that they need to fill the gap where US is choosing to relinquish responsibility.
Yeah, that's really scary to think about. And obviously that is one of the biggest dangers, I would say, of the Trump presidency. But what would you say are some of the other biggest dangers of Trump becoming president?
I'm sorry to say, I think there are lots. One of the really worrying concerns is going to be around global action on climate change. We've got the COP29 meeting coming up next week. We need some really good agreements from governments in that meeting in order that we can move forward. Donald Trump has said that when he becomes president, he's going to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, as he did last time when he was president. That's going to really complicate collective action on climate going forward. How do we deal with that? I think that we've got to try and find ways to manage climate action between states and whole regions without the United States on board. The United States would be only one of 4 countries that aren't in the Paris Agreement. Others are states like Yemen, Libya. So the United States on action, or rather lack of global action on climate under Trump, we can perceive as being exceptional and a one-off case. And hopefully we will be able to get enough of a coalition together without the United States to try and keep things moving forwards, even in their absence. The other area which I think is going to be disastrous could be in the Middle East. Trump, in his first term as presidency, lived up to his promise to be the greatest friend of Israel. A Trump peace plan was launched for Israel-Palestine. This peace plan basically endorsed the de facto annexation of most of the West Bank and proposed to make that a legal annexation of the West Bank. If that is the trend for a second Trump presidency, then it's really difficult to see how we can get agreements that are needed for an end to conflict in Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrifying to think about, and the effect that being the president and Trump's decisions can have on the rest of the world is massive. Lastly, is there anything that we should be praying for over the coming weeks, over the coming months?
Yes, I think that we need to be thinking about and praying around political narratives. I think we're going to have a tough time with the sort of divisive and even aggressive rhetoric which we've come to know from Donald Trump in the past. I think that we don't want politics to go down that route. I think we need leading figures who are able to use a very different type of narrative, one that respects that people have differences, and we need to work through those differences with good conversations with each other. I think this is something we're very much concerned with in terms of the narratives of UK politics within the UK. And if there's a role that we as individuals or churches can play through having a different type of narrative, then we need to pray that through. From that point of view, the Joint Public Issues team have got the Constituency Action Network program, which we're launching at the moment, which is all about how we have a narrative with our own MPs. And let's try and model a respectful narrative together, both in politics and in wider society as well.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining me today to talk about the presidential election. And we thank you for listening to another episode of the 10 Minutes On podcast. If you enjoyed this episode or you found it insightful, please check out our other episodes and share it with those you know. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you very much.